I thought I'd start this slidecast for Chapter 4 by showing you some pictures of the four styles of wall painting in Pompeii. Beard does a good job of discussing concisely and clearly this important aspect of wall decoration from Pompeii. In a nutshell, over roughly a 200-year period, we see four different styles of wall painting in Pompeian homes. The earliest style, known appropriately enough as the first style, which we see here, is made to look like fancy blocks of colored marble. In reality, it's painted plaster that covers their cement walls. I love this about the Pompeians. They're quite happy to resort to fakery and illusion in the decoration of their homes. Recall those columns from the House of the Faun that were plaster laid over a brick core. This wall decoration would have been expensive, but much cheaper than real colored marble. All of this is happening in the 2nd century BC, so a time when the Pompeians are starting to enjoy the benefits of being part of the growing Roman Empire, which is expanding and conquering, among others, the Greeks. This is the era when we see that wonderful Alexander mosaic in the House of the Faun. At a certain point, they start to play around and create not just the illusion of expensive colored marble, but also the illusion of depth. Here you can see columns on a ledge that appears in front of the back wall of colored marble blocks. This, in turn, leads into the second style, which is usually dated at the time that those soldiers of Sulla were settled in the colony of Pompeii after the Social War. The second style is a huge jump. You can see here how dramatic the illusion of space has become, with a columned wall opening up onto more distant space, which often has other architecture, little round temples or colonnades, receding in the background. This is from the villa at Oplantus. It's not in Pompeii proper, but nearby on the train line, and I very much recommend a visit to the villa if you have the time on your vacation to the Bay of Naples. I like the traditional idea that this style may have come with the resettling of those Roman soldiers in around 80 BC. It seems like it would require something significant in the life of the town for them to make such a leap in wall decoration. And the usual explanation for the different styles is that Pompeii is following, a few years behind, the fashions of the more hip, cool Rome. You can see from the doorway how high the painting goes at this villa in Oplantus. It's just about the best preserved example of Roman wall painting that still remains on its original walls, rather than being removed to a museum. Here's a nice detail of the colonnade in the background. See how they make it darker because it's further back. This is an example of atmospheric perspective and is really quite advanced in terms of illusionistic painting techniques. Here is another detail with a theatrical mask and that wonderful peacock with his tail draped over the balustrade and extending towards us. This always makes me think of Shell's brewery in New Ulm, where they have peacocks strutting around their beautiful gardens. The wealthy have always liked exotic pleasure gardens. The second style seems to be in vogue for about 60 years, and then around 15 BC, during the height of the Augustan period, we see the third style. In this style, there is still architecture in a wall, but now the architecture becomes impossibly thin. Columns turn into delicate little candelabra. Here is a detail which shows these little winged creatures at the top of a candelabra. I love this style, especially since the illusion of space in the second style can feel a little overwhelming, and I can imagine getting a little seasick living in a second style room my whole life. The third style often constructs a central open space for little paintings of landscapes or myth. And with Augustus's conquering Egypt and Cleopatra, and his adding of that territory to the Roman Empire, Egyptian things become all the craze in Rome. We see a reflection of that in the third style, with many allusions to Egypt and Egyptian culture. Here we can see the jackal-headed god Anubis. The next two show a couple of mythical stories from third style paintings. This one depicts Polyphemus in the center, and you can identify him from his one eye, trying to woo the nymph Galatea, seated on a dolphin with her cloak billowing out behind her. A later episode from Polyphemus' life story is included in the background. There he is throwing rocks at the departing Greek ships after Odysseus blinded him. This next one shows Perseus flying in from the left to rescue Andromeda from the sea monster. Again, the story is conflated as we see the earlier episode where Perseus met with Andromeda's father to work out a deal to marry her if he could rescue her. I love the landscapes that these third-style mythical stories are set into, and the fact that they combine episodes into a single frame. These paintings are now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, so look for them if you ever go. They were originally in one of the villas from Bosco Trecase near Pompeii, but we find almost exact copies of these in some Pompeian houses. Finally, let's move on to the fourth style. This is a famous dining room from the house of the Vetii. The characteristics of this style seem to me so completely Roman. They just combine everything, throw it all together into a blender from all the earlier styles. You have the painted blocks at the base of the room from the first style. The partially opened wall giving you a glimpse onto architecture in the background is from the second style. The framed space for pictures of mythical stories is from the third style, though now they are very large. A kind description of this would be eclectic. I love seeing everything in this room, but I don't know how you could live in it. It's just so busy. Here you can see from these students in the room that it's not a very large space. The photographer is standing on the threshold where the room opens out onto the garden. These mythical paintings from the fourth style are fantastic. We really get to see some fascinating details from the stories, and they flesh out for us the way ancient people, Pompeians in particular, envisioned these myths. Here, Hera is seated on a throne, and Hermes stands in front and center before her as he oversees the punishment of Ixion, who had tried to rape her. Except that Zeus had made a cloud that looked just like Hera, so Ixion ends up caught in the act, so to speak, though no harm comes to Hera. He's punished by being affixed to a wheel. That's him and his wheel in the background. The theme of unusual sexual desires and punishment continues in this dining room of the Vetii with the story of Pasiphae and Daedalus. Pasiphae was, you'll remember, the queen of Crete, married to King Midas, and you'll remember not King Midas. Who was this king of Crete? I'll remember him in a moment. You'll remember, though, that he had refused to sacrifice a beautiful white bull that Poseidon had sent him. As punishment, the gods inspired Pasiphae to fall in love with the bull, and she instructs Daedalus to construct for her a hollow cow, a little bit like a miniature Trojan horse. Then she'll climb inside and bring to fulfillment her desire for the bull, which will result, 9 months later, in the birth of the Minotaur. Well, that's my recap of the four styles. One thing that I think is worth thinking about, that Beard perhaps does not bring out enough, is the fact that Pompeian society, and presumably Roman society as well, that most everyone was following each other pretty closely in the decoration of their houses. This suggests that society was both uniform and competitive in a way that produced these similar styles. People were keeping an eye on each other and on the trends in Rome, and they didn't want to be left behind when it came to the decoration of their houses. Well, for the balance of the slidecast, I thought I would take you through a tour of other wall paintings from Pompeii to give you an even greater visual sense of the variety that we find there. Many of these come from the great Archaeological Museum in Naples, and on your trip to Pompeii, you definitely want to reserve an afternoon for touring that museum. It is, for me, the greatest collection of Roman stuff in the world and should not be missed. And although archaeologists lament that so much was cut out from the walls and carted off to the Naples Museum, these slides show you why that was, in retrospect, a good thing. Most paintings that were left in Pompeii have faded or fallen apart, and it's really only in the museum that we get a good sense of their brilliant color and subtle details. The plaster itself starts to dissolve or crack after a house has been excavated, and soon the archaeologists are putting together puzzles of paintings that have fallen to the floor. Or people who visit the site damage the paintings with graffiti or just for fun. And there are so few guards present on site that it's fairly easy for people to do something stupid. Here you can see the hole in the wall where a central scene was carved out and probably sent off to the museum, though paintings have also been stolen straight off the walls. It's true that we lose a valuable sense of the physical context for a painting when it's been removed from a house, but the paintings preserved in the museum are stunning. Here is a beautiful second-style wall painting. Second style, of course, because the central window looks out onto this little round temple, and the theatrical masks you can see perched up on the ledge. I find the huge hanging fish a little bizarre. We'll see some other examples of still life, and they are usually integrated a little bit better into the scene. Here is a beautiful painted stucco. This is only one panel, in fact, of 3. I don't know much about stucco, but I would have to think that it would have been a good bit more expensive than a simple wall painting. It gives an even greater illusion of real space in that it actually sticks out towards the viewer. This one reminds me of the facade of a like this one from Spain. And I've mentioned previously how that second style was thought to be much influenced by the theater. It makes sense to think of the Romans going to a show, which would of course be one of the most impressive visual experiences they could have, and then wanting to replicate that feeling in their homes. Some of the paintings reference theater directly. In this scene we seem to be backstage, where the seated actor may have played some kind of king, thus his scepter. The woman stares at the mask. Is she a fan, or someone who works backstage? And another actor appears to be disrobing. Here we see perhaps 2 actors from comedy with their masks. Other sorts of performance-related paintings include musicians, and it's interesting to see that they are women here. In fact, it's interesting to see the number of women in Pompeian paintings overall. It's clear that just from the paintings themselves how central a feature of Roman society they were. They weren't quite hidden away as much as they were in the Greek world. We also see some chariot racing. While there are several graffiti that depict gladiatorial combat, I don't know of any paintings that do that. There is, however, this wonderfully strange depiction of a famous riot that appeared in 59 AD between the Pompeians and their neighbors, the Nucerians, in the amphitheater in Pompeii. You can see pairs of people fighting all over the scene. It takes some liberties in its depiction of the amphitheater. If you count up, for example, the arches of the stairway, there are 11 in the painting, but only 6 in the actual structure. But in many other details, it is accurate and real. We know, for example, that the Pompeians did make use of awnings for some shows, and you can see the awnings over the top. There was a large walled-in and colonnaded recreational space, complete with a pool next door, and they've shown this. You can even see the inscription that would have originally been affixed to the outer wall of the space. But I have so many questions about this painting. The main one being, why did someone want to commemorate this event on the walls of the peristyle of their house? An important subject of Pompeian wall painting was religion, especially the painting of the Lauraria. These were little shrines, usually located within the houses, where they worshipped the Lares, the protecting deities of the home and family. They often have snakes coming from below, as we see here, and these may have been the embodiment of the Genius, the divine spirit of the head of the household. In the upper zone of this painting, we see a sacrifice with the head of the household in his toga at the center. A flute player and animal attendant are ready to help conduct the sacrificial ritual. The Lares stand at either end, bigger than the human figures, elaborately pouring their wine. This version of the Laurarium is similar, although notice that it stands at the end of a bar counter. It probably was meant to protect the family who ran the establishment. It's sometimes hard to know exactly how the Pompeians would have viewed all the little Cupids and Venuses and Mars that can be found on the walls of Pompeii. We see them as mythological, connected to many of our favorite stories and not so religious, but it's probably wrong to overlook that they were gods, and that Venus in particular was a protector of the city. The colony was officially named Veneria Cornelia Pompeii, the Veneria meaning Venus's city. Here she is, lounging on her seashell as she is born from the sea. This painting comes from a beautifully painted back garden wall of a really nice house. Botticelli, of course, in the Renaissance, painted a famous similar scene, but without having seen this earlier version. The ancient painting seems very high quality to me, except for the strange twisting of her legs. There is also a nice garden scene next to her, and a wonderful Mars as well. Here is a less successful Venus, I think, from the Naples Museum, but you can see how there must have been pattern books available to these ancient painters from which they could generate almost identical versions of a painting. As in the other Venus painting, you can see her Cupid attendant behind and the similar posture and positioning of her legs. Another popular theme of these Pompeian paintings are landscapes. They often include bits and pieces of architecture, colonnades receding into the distance, or sacred buildings. You can see here a tripod on the right, perhaps part of a temple at the center with someone entering, maybe a priestess? This scene is similarly composed, but looks more Egyptian to me. The bird is probably an ibis, and there is a man fishing off to the right. The Romans always loved these Egyptian scenes. Egypt for them was like a combination of the greatest zoo with all its exotic animals, the most spectacular imaginary place like a Walt Disney World, and the Vatican with all its ancient religion. Two more themes from ancient painting strike me as very modern: still lifes and portraits. Here we see a fourth-style painting from a villa in Bosco Tre Case, but the interesting part is the topmost zone with various still life scenes. This detail from that painting shows various food items, a popular still life subject then and now. You can see eggs, birds hung up, a pitcher. Any thoughts on what the cup spoon would have been for? I saw one scholar speculate that it was for the cooking of an egg, kind of the holding of it in the boiling water. I love this scene. On the top you can see piles of coins, but the bottom is dedicated to various objects related to writing. From the left you have a stylus, and probably I don't know what it's sitting on there. It might be an inkwell of some sort. There's a scroll next, and then two wax tablets with another stylus. So the first actually might be a pen. In fact, when I look at it a little more closely now, it looks like a reed pen that you perhaps would have used with ink. One of the things that struck me in looking at paintings this week was how much emphasis they put on writing. Scenes like this are in several still lifes, but we also find the importance of writing featured prominently in many portraits. Here you see a beautiful portrait that is labeled Sappho. It's probably not intended to be the Greek poet at all. Archaeologists just always like to name paintings and things that they find with some famous name from history or literature. This is probably rather a portrait of a local Pompeian woman. She holds a stylus and a writing tablet, and the gold-colored hairnet was an expensive adornment. Here's another famous painted couple from Pompeii. It's interesting in these that the women tend to hold the stylus and the writing tablet, and the men hold the scrolls. This was obviously a popular portrait type, but still, I don't think people would have chosen it if it did not in some way affirm their sense of themselves and what was important to them. Beard talks a little bit about literacy in Chapter 5, and she follows the scholarly consensus that it would have been very low. By modern definitions of literacy, this is probably true, but my sense of the graffiti is that more people knew how to write and valued it than we would have imagined, and the pictures confirm that for me. Here's one last portrait. I love how particular and identifiable they come across. And this fellow has a beautiful white beard, just like mine is starting to turn. It must have been the case that people sat for these portraits. The paintings I really find intriguing are the ones that show odd bits and pieces of ordinary life. This one comes from a bar and shows people gambling or playing some kind of board game. Probably gambling, actually, probably rolling dice. This one comes from an inn and was painted on a hallway that led to a bathroom. It shows a boy crouching with snakes framing him. The figure to the right holds a cornucopia and a tiller and is reminiscent of depictions of Fortuna. What the painting shows and what it was intended for might have remained obscure except for the inscription which reads, Cacator cave malum. You who take a shit, beware evil. The best interpretation was that it was intended to get people to continue down the hallway all the way to the latrine to take care of their bathroom needs rather than doing their business in the hallway. We have similar warnings in other parts of Pompeii, although usually down deserted alleyways outside. And the Roman satirist Persius even describes one of these generic paintings with snakes threatening a cacator. The next two paintings show people working in a fullery, the Roman equivalent of a dry cleaning operation. To get the clothes clean, they started the process by treading on the clothes in a solution that included urine. The ammonia in the urine was the primary cleaning agent. Then it went through several more rinsings. Finally, they hung out the clothes and brushed them, and in the case of the whites, hung them on a wicker cage and fumigated them with burning sulfur. It must have been a nasty and smelly work, but I love that we have these paintings from an actual fullery. This same building and paintings are responsible for one of my favorite graffiti. Fullones ululamque cano non arma virumque. I sing of fullers and their owl, not arms in the man. A play on the beginning of Virgil's Aeneid. You can see an owl in this painting. One explanation for the connection between fullers and owls that I've seen is that they did their work at night like owls, and thus associated themselves with the bird. Works for me. The next two slides show some of the street scenes that Beard mentions in Chapter 4. People shopping and bargaining on the street. Does seem very Italian to me. This slide shows the people in the forum in front of the equestrian statues. Beard and others have interpreted the people as reading some scroll displayed across the front of the statues. I'm not entirely convinced of this. The scroll extends past the bases of the statues, and there are other paintings where writing is represented, so why is this scroll empty here? I wonder if it was some guideline from an earlier version of the painting. It runs parallel to the beam that goes across the top of the columns, and perhaps that was the ground line for the columns originally? I don't know. One last painting from real life. The first shows people buying bread from a bakery stall. We actually have carbonite found in excavated ovens at Pompeii that looked very much like this, round and divided into wedges. Now there is one more category of ordinary life often represented in paintings, namely sex, but I'll leave that for a later slidecast. The last 15 slides show some mythical paintings from Pompeii. Between Pompeii and Greek vases, we get almost all our painted representations of ancient myth, and it is fascinating to see what details they emphasize and how they tell the story visually. I won't narrate these slides, though I will tell you the subjects to look for. Here in this first one, first two in fact, are depictions of the Achilles that we talked about last week. The ones from an atrium showing him first charging at Agamemnon at the beginning of the Iliad, and then dressed as a girl as he tries to hide from the Greeks who are preparing to sail to Troy. He gets caught when he shows, as you can see here, more interest in the weapons than the household goods for sale. It was an ancient sting operation by Odysseus, and they got Achilles to reveal himself. Other stories to watch for include several Mars and Venuses, especially where she strips him of his weapons, Medea contemplating the killing of her children, Perseus with Medusa's head on his belt rescuing Andromeda, Theseus being thanked for killing the Minotaur, Theseus abandoning Ariadne on the island of Naxos, the nymph Thetis, mother of Achilles, going to get special armor for her son, the centaur Nessus begging forgiveness from Hercules, Narcissus falling in love with his own reflection in the pool, Europa being carried off by Zeus, who's turned himself into a bull, Cupid being punished by Venus for his naughtiness, Iphigenia being sacrificed by her father Agamemnon so that the gods would help him by giving him a helping wind to sail to Troy, and at the very end, that strange pygmy version of the Judgment of Solomon. I won't narrate them as I go, but look for those as the slidecast ends. That's the Agamemnon. Oh, I'm sorry, Achilles, as he's about to rush probably at Agamemnon. So those first two were opposite each other in an atrium.